Welcome everyone, and thank you very much to Dr. Paul Swan and his team for coming today. And today we're going to be talking about toying with tangrams. Now, we haven't used tangrams a lot as a family, or I haven't used tangrams a lot. However, they're a 7-piece puzzle to form shapes and to make puzzles and patterns. So I'm looking forward to hearing about how we can use them more. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Paul Swan. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Heather. And basically, yeah, we're going to look at the idea of the 7-piece tangram. There are other sorts of tangrams and other sort of geometric puzzles that you can use, but we'll begin by focusing on the tangram, and then we might just look at one other puzzle toward the end. Essentially, we have some downloads for you as well, so that if you don't have access to a plastic tangram, you can cut one out. So I'll just show you here. We've got a sheet that if you wanted to download that and then cut it out, then you can participate in the activities that we'll try today. So I just need to talk about some of the vocabulary to do with tangrams, and then we'll be able to begin properly. So I'll get you to have a look at the visualizer here, and I'll show you some tangram pieces. I'll name them, and then we can start using the pieces and look at different activities and ideas that we can do. So let's have a look at the bit here. Now, a couple of things you might notice. I always like to get my tangrams in different colors, and that just makes it easier if you're in a classroom setting. You know, someone's using the blue ones, the red ones, and so forth, and that they don't get mixed up that way. But we'll just use one set at the moment. We'll just use the red ones for now. And a couple of things here. The other thing I like to do is there are 7 pieces that make up this tangram set. And essentially one of the things I do is when I hand them out, I get children to make up the original tangram square to check that we've got all the pieces. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So if you have a look here, I'll just put the pieces on and you'll see, and we'll talk about the names of the pieces as well. So I'm just going to place them on top of the grid that we've got there, and you'll see we've got these triangles and a few other pieces here. And it's always handy to do this just to make sure you've got a full set, and you start to see that I've got these ones here, and the last piece will be sitting in here. It's the triangle. So that's not a bad little practice to get in place, because nothing worse than starting the puzzle, finding you've adopted extra pieces or something like that. Now what I'm going to do to start with is just to name those pieces. So I'll move this off here and I'll just take these pieces. We're going to take 5 of the pieces straight away, and you'll notice that they're all triangles. And just to give you an idea, I'm in the same way. So I have the same orientation, and sitting here, you'll notice that we've got 5 triangles make up the set. Now, in terms of those triangles, they're a very specific sort of triangle, and I'll develop that language a bit more. So you can see here, we've got what we might call a right angle triangle. So in this case here, all of these triangles, the triangles are right angle. Doesn't matter whether I rotate it around there, your triangle's still got a right angle here. The second thing is, you'll notice that the 2 sides are the same length. So this side here and this side here are both the same length. So we would refer to that as isosceles triangle. Isosceles is based on 2 words or 2 ideas. Scales means legs, and then iso means same. So if you think about something like a ladder, it would have 2 legs that are the same length. And so we've got an isosceles triangle, but the other side of it is it's a right angle isosceles triangle. So see how complex this gets. Triangle literally means 3 angles. And then we've got isosceles, that's 2 words. That means the legs are the same. And then we've got the idea of right angle. So there's 5 of those triangles. But if you look at those triangles again, let me go through a little bit more information. These 2, you'll see, fit on top of one another. And what I'll do is I'll just change to a different one so you can see it a bit easier there. See how it fits exactly on top? And therefore we would use the word congruent, which means exactly the same size and exactly the same shape. However, if you look at the red one to the yellow one, you can see they're the same sort of shape there. So I'll get you to look in once again. If you look at the visualizer, you'll see that this is the same idea. It's the same sort of triangle, but the sizes are different. And so the word that we'd use for that is similar. So straight away, just when you're using the tangrams, there's a lot of names to come across, or mathematical vocabulary, we might say. Now, if we think about geometry, geometry literally means earth measure. Geometry is made up of 3 ideas, 3 key ideas. There's the idea of what it is, where it is, and how it moves or changes. So the what it is the naming of things like the 2D and 3D bits. And we've just been naming triangles, and you can see how complex that is. So we got the idea of naming things. We got the what is it? The where is it is the location it is. And then the last bit is how it moves or changes. So the flip, slide, turn sort of ideas. Let's just name the last two pieces and then we'll get on with the activity. So there's two more pieces. You'll get a square and you'll get a parallelogram. Now make a little comment about a square. Some children call this a diamond because when it's rotated like that, it might look like that. But in fact, I say to children, there it is as a square. As I rotate it, when did it stop being a square? It's still a square, it's just been rotated or turned, in this case, 45 degrees and so forth. So essentially that's about this turning or idea. The last piece there is this piece here that we've got, and that's a parallelogram. So you can see that the sides, if I'll just put it down there, they're parallel to each other. Now, the funny thing is that we could also call those pieces quadrilaterals. That is, they have four laterals or four sides. But the best name for this one is a square, and the best name for this one is a parallelogram. And those 7 pieces make up the full set. And sometimes people just think about tangrams as puzzle pieces and so forth. But we'll start with puzzles because there's a lot to get from that. And we've made a few puzzles available for you. I thought we might have a look at a couple. So here's the Loch Ness Monster. We could have a look at that one and we'll put it onto the visualizer and so forth. Now, the way we've designed this puzzle is so that the pieces fit exactly. I mean, you notice as I start fitting these pieces, they start to fit on here. This piece might fit here and so forth. And so the children are getting a bit of a feeling for, no, that doesn't fit. So we've now got to try another piece and so forth. Maybe that goes like that. And we start to get a feeling for, oh, that one might be a square and so forth. Now, notice as I was doing that a minute ago, that essentially not only are placing pieces, so I'm now getting an idea of angles because you get the idea of the right angle and it places in a certain spot, a bit like a jigsaw. When you start looking at those corner pieces, that's a pretty good strategy to do there. So one, I was placing the pieces. The second, as I was placing them, I was doing a couple of different things. Sometimes I was turning or rotating the pieces, and we'll talk about that rotation idea in a minute. And sometimes I was flipping or turning it over, that piece, and I was fitting. So essentially there, not only am I using pieces, but now I'm doing that flip, slide, turn, or that rotation, translation idea and so forth. So even when you're doing what might seem a pretty basic puzzle and filling the puzzle in, there's a lot of geometric thinking that's going on as we do that. So now I'll just get you returned to the Loch Ness Monster puzzle, and we'll talk about a couple of other things here. As we do this, sometimes some children may not realize what's happening. So here's a little tip that I often do. Often with the piece, I'll mark in the corner. You can see it's marked a little X. And so as you move that, you can start to notice the movement. But not only that, watch. As I flip this over, you can see it's flipped because now that little mark has gone. And so that's just a little tip to try and sort of focus children on what's happening as this goes on. Now, a couple of things here. That puzzle was a direct one-to-one puzzle. In other words, the shape fitted directly on top of the pieces. Ideally, children can use these shapes, trace around them, and then they can make their own puzzles, which is pretty neat. But we put a couple of other puzzles in there just to get people to think a little bit. And basically, if you take the same puzzle, so I'm now going to do a different one, and you'll see it here. It's just the one that's got the camels on it and so forth. But you might notice that the picture of the camel is smaller. And I'll show you when we put it down on the visualizer exactly what I mean. So if you have a look here, and you have a look at this little camel here, and you'll notice that no, the pieces no longer fit exactly on the top. And so this puzzle's a bit harder because you have to recreate that idea, but you can't fit a one-to-one match with the pieces. So a couple of things here. If you've got some of these sort of puzzles, you can reduce them in size, and then it's a little bit harder because now I can't do this direct matching and so forth. And that's a pretty neat sort of idea that sits in there. So as a good introduction to Tangram, if you just do some of those puzzles, you're learning all that early geometry, which is a pretty neat thing. But I'd hate you to think that Tangrams are just about that idea. In fact, just to show you a little bit different, we'll go back to our original square. Yeah, you might have it in your set there. So just a reminder, if you haven't already cut that up, then that'll be your original square. I'm going to put that down onto the visualizer now, and we'll have a look at some things we can do with this. Okay, so there's our original tangram, and you can start to get some notion here of some fraction ideas, because essentially tangrams will help me with this notion of the fraction idea. Now with the fraction, we got to know some ideas of area or length. So we're going to use an area idea for fractions today, and we've got to talk about what the whole is and what part of that whole might be. So if you have a look down here, what I'm going to do is start to put some pieces onto our original tangram square. We'll have a look here, and you'll start to see what's happening as we look on here, and you'll see that if you look here, I've covered, and here, if this whole tangram, the 7 pieces, represents an area of 1 square unit, I've covered half of it, and you start to get the idea of what might happen here. Now, I could cover half of it with all of these different pieces. So essentially, we can start to get the idea of halves and quarters and so forth. In fact, a tangram can be used to go as far as 16ths, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So I'll get you to look at the visualizer. I'll use 2 different color pieces to make that clear for you. So if you think about it, this is covering, that's covering half, but that red piece will be covering 1/4 of that. Now, if you think about this, if I take this piece and you start moving it around, see how I'm rotating it, this is doing half of the quarter, so that's 1/8. Or you can see here that it would take 8 more bits like that to cover that same thing. And if you look here, let's compare this other piece here. This is 1/2 of that piece. And so you start to get a feel. So notice I'm rotating it around, trying to get it to fit. See the things that I've learned earlier are starting to be applied here and so forth. And you start to see that that's covered 1/2 of that. So this piece here represents 1/16 of the entire area of that tangram. And so it's good for us not to just think that tangrams are just these little puzzles that we play with, but we're starting to get, notice I used the rotation, I fitted pieces on top of one another, and I was able to use some fractional language to develop that. Now, just to make that a bit simpler, let's just use a couple of pieces, and we can ask a couple of questions that deal with that. So I'll take you back down on the visualizer. We'll take our original tangram away, and let's just go with these basic pieces. So I've got the red square. And if you think about that red square, I can put the yellow piece on it, and you can see that it covers half the area. And you can see here that 2 yellow pieces cover exactly the same area as does the red square. But I'm going to grab 2 green pieces. And if you have a look here, you'll see it's quite interesting, because now we're going to take this yellow parallelogram and watch what happens. I can also put, and once again, we've got to do some of this rotation, got to start to work out how it fits, how the piece might rotate in. You see I just rotated there, and you can start to see now, wow, so 2 green triangles also fit on that piece. So that means, if you think about it, this red square and this yellow parallelogram have the same area, and they are, if you look here, now we make a comparison. So we know that those 2 pieces fit on here, and we knew that this, the yellow pieces, would cover half. Notice I'm having to rotate around to start to get that idea that's building. So we're using those sort of skills we had before. Maybe we've got to play with this a bit. No, that doesn't quite fit. So you're starting to get the notion here that we have to sort of do a bit of thinking, and this is what we really want. So at this point here, I might have to turn this way, start playing with this, and you start to see now they are covering half the area of that. In other words, this piece, the red square, covers half the area of the larger triangle. This is quite complex, and so you should never think that these tangrams are just really basic sorts of ideas that sit there. And that's the basis for learning some fractional ideas as well. So they're all in proportion to one another, and the areas relate. That's the key bit that sits here. Let's take another idea, and it's really about taking some pretty basic sort of shape ideas that sit here. Now we know already that the 7 pieces can be used to form a square. But could I make a square using less than 7 pieces? So let's have a play with this sort of idea. I'm going to mix the colors up just to show it a little bit here. So let's take an example. Okay, so we've got a triangle. Now we know something about triangles. We can see here straight away, I'll just put this red one on top so you can see, that that's forming a corner. And we've almost formed half a square. So we're learning some of this bit about how shapes are made up of other shapes. And now I'm going to use some other pieces here. Now, we can form another triangle, because we just did, using those 2 pieces. And so we could see here, well, okay, so I've got to make something here. Maybe I've got to flip it around this way. Maybe got to rotate it and so forth. And we start to sort of get an idea of how we can start to form a square, and we might pose the problem. Can I form a square using 3 pieces? Or we might pose the problem, can I form a square using 4 pieces or 5 pieces? Now I'll give you a little tip. You can't make a square with 6 pieces. You can make them with 7 pieces, 5 pieces, 4, 3, 2, and obviously 1, because we've got a square already. And so as you start playing with that sort of idea, it makes us think a bit. But here's some other things I'd like to consider about shapes. We're going to put a couple of these together to make some other sort of shapes that you'll see in a minute. So we don't have a piece that's a pentagon, but we can make a pentagon. So let's put 2 pieces together. So we'll take the square. I'm going to take the red square. And if you see here, I'm going to put a piece on the top, and let's move it this way. And let's see what we've got. Okay, so what sort of piece do we have now? Do we have a pentagon? Let's check. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, we've still only got a quadrilateral, a 4-sided shape. So what else could we do to play with this? Well, maybe we need to do something like this. Well, let's just have a bit of a look now. Okay, so we've got 1 side there, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that doesn't look much like any pentagons I've ever seen. And so now we've got to think about, when we're talking about shapes, we can define shapes as being regular, or we could define them as being irregular. Now let's go back to this shape here in a sense, because we've got this notion of what regular shapes are and what irregular shapes are. So let's play with this idea. Notice that most of the side lengths, but not all of them, are the same. Also, the angles are different. Even more so, if you notice here, and I'm just going to do a little drawing here, this is caved in. Can you see? It's like, so we would refer to that as being concave. So it's amazing all the things that you can learn just by playing with some pretty basic shapes. So what have we played with so far? Well, there's 5 triangles that we looked at, and remembering they're right angle isosceles triangles. We've used phrases like congruent, means they're exactly the same size and exactly the same shape. We've used words like similar. Then what we've done is we've looked at how the areas relate between all those pieces, particularly when we added the square and the parallelogram. That allows us to do some things to do with proportion and to talk about the idea of some fractional language. And now what we've done is we've done that sort of turning and flipping and so forth, and we looked at the types of shapes. So they're not always just regular or the standard versions of shapes. They can be irregular as well. So it's just amazing all the things that you can do with a tangram. So now let's take it a little step further. Okay, and here's a little idea. You're just going to have to imagine a bit here. And what I'm going to do is basically what you need to imagine, and I'll just put us on the visualizer here and you'll see what I mean. That imagine that you had 2 people, and I'm just going to draw an imaginary, or not imaginary line, but here's a line between those 2 people. And imagine that you have somebody on this side of the line who has these tangrams, and somebody on this side of the line that has the green one. Okay. Now, what we're talking about here is a thing called a barrier game. So imagine that you've got a wall or a barrier between this person and this person here. Barrier games, probably one of the best barrier games that people know about is a game called Battleship. And in Battleship, you've got a person on side of a barrier. They have placed their ships, they've got coordinates, and the person on the other side has to guess what's on that side of the barrier. And what I like about a barrier game is a pretty simple idea. that someone has to use what they call expressive language, and in other words, explain what they've made in simple terms to the player on the other side of the barrier. Remember, they can't see anything. There's this barrier or wall between the two players. Now, when you're explaining, you need to be explicit about where the piece is, what the name of the piece is, how you might be moving it and adjusting. The person on the other side of the barrier has to listen very carefully. That's receptive language. They're listening to what the person is describing. And so therefore, not only are you talking about what the shape is, you're talking about where it is, and you're talking about how it moves around and changes and so forth. Now, to do this, you do need to be quite clear in your language. And if you think about that, think about the job of people like air traffic controllers, who need to be quite explicit about explaining places and where things are in relation to other pieces. So let's go back to the visualizer and imagine we took some of those pieces and think about how we might describe it. So imagine it's the red person here, and they build something like, they start to build this together. And I want you to think about the words that you might use to describe how to build exactly the same thing. So for example here, see we put these two pieces together. So we use the two small triangles and we formed a square, and you can see where it's fitting here. We might say, well, then you put the next square. I'll just use the yellow one to show you so you can see the contrast there. So then we put the square next to that piece. So we're talking about being next to. We could talk about being above. For example, what if I put, and I'll just show you using the yellow piece, right on top of that piece. So we could, is that above or are we built on top? And so we're using a lot of prepositions at this point here. And as we start to build, we could be building here. Then if you think about it, I have to explain to the person here because they can't see what I've built. So I need to be quite explicit in the language that I use to do that. So at this point here, I might have to say, well, I'd like you to take the large triangle. We don't need to necessarily say isosceles or right angle at this point here, but we want to be able to distinguish the large one from a smaller one. And so we'll need to use some language to describe that. So essentially the Tangram piece is allowing us to explore a lot of the geometry. And as I said, we can do all sorts of polygons. Now, polygon is the general word. Gon means angle, poly many angled sort of shapes by putting all of these together that happen there. So geometric problem solving involves this flip, slide, turn, that sort of identifying shapes, getting the focus on it. And it allows a lot of spatial reasoning that goes on in our minds. Now, we apply a lot of that in real life if you think about it. So that's the notion. Now, there's a lot of other Tangram ideas that we can do, but I think we've explored a fair bit of that. But there's one last thing I just want to sort of talk briefly. Essentially, Tangrams are a type of puzzle. And I'll just show you another example, just briefly here. And this is just a geometry cutout puzzle. But in this place here, we simply have some shapes. We've done an enlarged version of that. And you start to see here how this gets a bit more involved in the Tangram. So the Tangram might be the starting point that happens here. And then what we build on that is some instructions. So there's some words there. We cut it up. We have to reform it. We have to do that flip, slide, turn bit. We build the pieces that go together. Now, if you think about that, a lot of that is in things like architecture, building, all of those sort of ideas. So the reason I quite like Tangrams is you can still do some number work, like we did some fraction sort of work there and so forth, but it's appealing to the other sort of thinkers. So some children who struggle with sort of number type work actually are quite good at this, moving things around and turning them and flipping them and so forth. So hopefully there's a little bit of an idea that where Tangrams can fit, how they sort of work together and so forth. But basically there's a lot of these geometric dissection puzzles where you cut things up and then you reform them and put them together. Now we've been working in flat 2D sort of stuff, but likewise you could do the same with things like cubes. A Soma cube would be an example of that, a 3D sort of thing coming together. If you ever played games like Tetris, Tetris has that idea of the turning and the rotating and so forth. So a lot of these key ideas build this spatial visualization in your mind. So hopefully that's a little bit of an overview of what you can do with the Tangram. There's obviously a lot more, but hopefully that'll get people started.
Paul, thank you so much. I'm absolutely blown away with how much you can do with a Tangram and the fact that you can use it for so many different levels and abilities as well. So you could have multiple ages actually, and you could do something similar, but you could actually level it up. Is that correct? So you can make it a little bit harder with the language and talk about irregular shapes and regular shapes as well.
Yes, essentially what happens is, as I said, you can make the puzzles smaller, harder. You can change the language, expect a little bit different from young children just putting them directly on. Others will be creating their own ideas and so forth, setting puzzles for other people. So they're actually a bit more involved than what people first give them credit for.
Yeah, absolutely, they are indeed. Just to let everyone know that the webinar will be available on the 1st of the month. So the first of the month on Dr. Paul's Facebook pages, but then on @Dr. Paul Swan's YouTube channel and @EDX Education. The sheet is available on your website. Is that correct?
That's it.
Paul?
People can welcome to download it to ready for use for the seminar. Yep.
And also, just to let you know, there's lots of other resources available on drpaulswan.com.au for many different topics. There's also a book called Toying with Tangrams, which is great, and it's available in ebook as well if you are interested, if you're enticed. So thank you very much to Paul and his team for today, and we look forward to the next one, which would be, is it Number Sense? We're developing Number Sense on the 5th of October.
That's right. I'm going to use a number board or number grid. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to your team.
Right.